The gentle hum of the aircraft filled Evelyn Thompson's ears as she carefully settled into her first-class seat. She felt a nervous thrill, something like a teenager on her first adventure. This trip was for her grandson, a bright young man who'd just been promoted to judge, and she couldn't have been prouder. Her eyes shone with warmth as she looked out the window, the sight of endless skies bringing back memories of her younger days. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" A stewardess passed by, her voice tight and rushed. "Yes, if you could bring me a cup of tea, dear." "Thank you," Evelyn replied, her tone as gentle as a spring breeze. The stewardess barely nodded, glancing down at Evelyn's modest attire, a well-loved blue jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her wrinkled, kindly face. For Evelyn, every piece of her clothing carried meaning. Her jacket had once been her late husband's favorite, and her hat was a gift from her daughter. But to the stewardess, it was clear Evelyn was an odd fit for the luxurious world of first class. Moments later, the stewardess returned, slamming down a lukewarm cup of tea on the tray in front of Evelyn without a word. Evelyn's smile faltered, but she quietly thanked her and picked up the cup with a steady hand. Evelyn gazed around her. The other passengers were receiving smiles, small gestures of care, and attentive service. She took a slow sip of the tea, bitter and almost cold, her mind wandering back to her childhood, where her grandmother had taught her to sit tall, no matter how others may try to make you small. A lesson in dignity, the art of bearing hurt with grace. Beside her, a man in a perfectly tailored suit watched. Richard Sanders had boarded late, barely making the flight after back-to-back meetings, but he'd noticed Evelyn's quiet strength as soon as she sat down. Her calm composure intrigued him. Leaning over, he offered a gentle smile. "I hope you're having a pleasant trip," he began, unsure if she'd even want to chat. "Oh, I am, thank you," Evelyn replied with a glimmer in her eyes. She seemed almost amused by the contrast between her surroundings and her own life. "I'm actually on my way to see my grandson. He's recently been promoted to judge, a real dream of his." Richard's eyebrows raised. "A judge? That's impressive. Your grandson must be something special." "He is," she chuckled softly, eyes proud. "A long road he's walked, but he's never let obstacles stop him. You know, just last week he told me something his mother used to say. The world may try to put you in your place, but you keep walking." Richard nodded thoughtfully. He, too, understood the challenges of persistence. Wise words. "And clearly, you've set an example that's left a mark on him." Just then, the stewardess returned, her gaze passing over Evelyn dismissively before fixing on Richard. Her demeanor shifted instantly, her voice suddenly sugar-coated. "Mr. Sanders, can I get you anything? Perhaps a champagne refill?" Richard's lips pressed into a line as he observed the stark contrast in her tone and attentiveness. "No, thank you," he replied coldly, giving her a look that suggested he'd noticed her behavior. As the stewardess walked away, Evelyn's gaze lowered, an old sorrow flashing in her eyes. She was used to this kind of treatment but hadn't expected it here, in first class. Richard saw her change in expression. "I'm sorry, that was entirely inappropriate," he said gently. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steady. "It's all right. Some people see only what they want to see." Richard hesitated, then replied, "It shouldn't have to be. You deserve the same respect as anyone else here." A beat of silence fell between them, and Evelyn gave him a small smile. "Well, thank you for saying that. I find comfort knowing that the world still has a few kind hearts." As their conversation continued, Evelyn shared more about her life, how she had spent years as a school teacher in a small town, raising her family with love and integrity. Each memory unfolded like the turning pages of a book. Richard, too, opened up, revealing bits of his world as CEO of a sprawling corporation, including this very airline. He spoke of his desire to improve customer experiences to make sure his passengers felt truly valued. "I have to admit, it's challenging," he confessed, his gaze drifting thoughtfully. "With a company this size, it's difficult to ensure that everyone understands the importance of respect." Evelyn nodded, smiling slightly. "Change is rarely easy. It's like turning an old, creaky door. But once you've put the effort in, sometimes you find that the door opens to something beautiful. Their eyes met with a spark of understanding, a shared sense of resilience. In Richard's presence, Evelyn felt respected in a way she hadn't in a long time, and it warmed her. But that warmth was abruptly chilled when the stewardess returned, this time placing Evelyn's meal tray in front of her without a word. As she looked down, her stomach turned. The food was unappetizing, almost spoiled. Richard watched as Evelyn composed herself, trying to maintain her dignity. She reached out, gently pushing the tray aside. "Thank you," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Richard's jaw clenched as he caught the stewardess's eye. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice steely. The stewardess looked surprised, taken aback by his tone. She stammered, "I am sorry, Mr. Sanders, I didn't realize." "Clearly, you didn't," he replied sharply, his voice cold. Evelyn laid a hand on Richard's arm, her voice soft but firm. "Please, Mr. Sanders, let's not make a scene. I've learned that sometimes dignity is our best response." Richard relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on the stewardess, who quickly retreated down the aisle, casting a quick, furtive glance over her shoulder. Evelyn watched her leave, her expression unreadable. After a few moments, Richard turned back to Evelyn. "No one should be treated like that, especially not someone like you." Evelyn gave him a warm, reassuring smile. "I've seen a lot, Mr. Sanders. It's people like you, people who care enough to speak up, who keep me hopeful." Richard took a deep breath, something in him feeling unexpectedly moved. "You have no idea how much your words mean to me. I think you have a gift, Evelyn, a wisdom that could make a real difference." Evelyn shook her head, but her eyes sparkled with a quiet strength. "I'm just a woman who's lived a life. And if that can help others, then maybe there's a purpose to everything." In that instant, Richard knew he'd met someone extraordinary, someone who had the power to inspire change just by being herself. And Evelyn, looking at Richard, felt an old, almost forgotten hope stirring in her heart. As the plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, Richard felt the urge to learn more about Evelyn. Her calm in the face of rudeness, her graceful way of speaking. There was something magnetic about her. Richard leaned closer, his voice low. "Evelyn, I can't help but notice how gracefully you handled everything back there. I would have been furious." Evelyn gave a small, amused smile. "Age teaches you patience, Richard. A calm heart can do more than an angry voice." Richard chuckled. "I could use some of that wisdom in my line of work. I deal with complaints and issues daily, but people usually aren't as understanding as you." She tilted her head, curiosity in her eyes. "And what kind of issues would the CEO of a company like yours face?" "Oh," Richard sighed, leaning back. "Corporate culture, customer satisfaction. You wouldn't believe the balancing act required. People expect efficiency and warmth. Yet keeping our team motivated and respectful isn't always straightforward." "Corporate culture," she repeated, thinking. "It must be challenging to make sure everyone's treated with dignity." "Exactly." And he paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's more complicated than people realize. We hire from all walks of life, but aligning everyone to a vision of respect, that's the hard part." Evelyn listened, absorbing his words. "You know, Richard, sometimes respect has less to do with policies and more with leading by example. People don't just follow rules. They follow the tone set at the top." Richard looked at her, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I like that perspective. Lead by example." He leaned forward, suddenly energized. "Evelyn, would you believe that I've been looking for a way to shake things up at the company? And here you are, practically handing me the insight I needed." She gave him a knowing smile. "Sometimes, answers come in unexpected ways, Richard." They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Richard could sense that Evelyn held a depth of experience, and he was growing more certain that she could help him bring about real change. He cleared his throat, daring to ask, "Would you ever consider helping me, Evelyn?" Be part of a campaign to inspire respect and kindness in the industry. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. Me? Oh, I don't know about that. I'm just an old schoolteacher with a lifetime of lessons. But that's exactly why you're perfect, Richard replied eagerly. Your story, your approach, it's what people need. We could use someone like you to remind us of what matters. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Let me think about it, Richard. It's not a small thing you're asking. Richard nodded, sensing her reluctance. Of course. Just know, if you ever say yes, the impact could be huge. Your perspective would mean a lot to so many people. Before Evelyn could respond, the stewardess reappeared, her expression tense. She placed another tray before Evelyn, her eyes darting nervously between Evelyn and Richard. This time, the food was fresh and the tray arranged with care. I hope this is more to your liking, ma'am, she murmured, her voice lacking the previous sharpness. Evelyn glanced at the food, her face impassive. Thank you, she said softly, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving, but with a dignity that made the stewardess shift uncomfortably. Richard watched, feeling a strange satisfaction in the stewardess's discomfort. As she walked away, he murmured, "It's amazing how people can change their tune when they know someone's watching." Evelyn shook her head slowly. It's sad, isn't it? That respect depends on who's watching rather than being something genuine. Richard's smile faded. You're right. That's precisely why I think you could make a difference. You know, you'd be helping me fix the very thing that just happened here. Evelyn looked away, a glimmer of old memories in her eyes. Let's see. I've always believed that we're each given opportunities to leave this world a little kinder. Richard tilted his head, studying her. Evelyn, may I ask, what keeps you so grounded? After all, the way that stewardess treated you, many people wouldn't have reacted with such grace. Evelyn's smile was distant, almost sad. I was taught, long ago, that kindness isn't something you show because others deserve it. You show it because it's who you are. She met his gaze, and he could feel the weight of her words. That stewardess may not respect me, but I respect myself enough not to stoop to her level. Richard was silent, absorbing her words. He felt a renewed determination. Evelyn's wisdom was like a flame in the dark, lighting the path forward. Would you consider having dinner with me after the flight, Evelyn? I'd like to continue this conversation. She hesitated, but finally nodded. All right, Richard. I'd be honored to join you. As the plane began its descent, Richard's heart felt lighter. He had come on this flight preoccupied with work, but now his mind buzzed with new ideas. Evelyn's presence was refreshing, like a balm for a weary soul. He could see the possibilities in involving her in his campaign, a beacon of hope for the company and for himself. When the plane touched down, Richard escorted Evelyn through the terminal. They attracted a few curious glances. A sharply dressed CEO and an elderly woman in a faded blue jacket didn't seem like a common pair. But Richard was too absorbed to care. Outside, a driver waited with a sleek car. Evelyn glanced at it and then back at Richard. I never thought I'd arrive in such style. Richard chuckled. Nothing but the best for my mentor. Evelyn laughed, a warm sound that made Richard's smile wider. They climbed into the car, and soon they were seated at an elegant restaurant. As they ordered, Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. Evelyn, I know this is sudden, but would you consider coming on board as a spokesperson for our company? We need a voice that's honest, that understands what it means to treat people with dignity. Evelyn's eyes searched his, weighing the sincerity in his gaze. Richard, that's a big commitment. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. She paused. But why me? Because you've seen and endured what many people go through in silence. And because you don't carry anger with you, you carry wisdom. That's what we need. He took a deep breath, feeling vulnerable. I need someone like you. Someone who reminds people what true respect looks like. Evelyn sipped her tea, her gaze distant. I'll think about it, Richard. I don't make decisions lightly, but your words have touched me. Richard felt a surge of hope. He had no idea if she would agree, but simply knowing she was considering it was more than he could have asked for. They spent the next hour talking, their conversation weaving through their lives, hopes, and visions for a better world. Richard realized that Evelyn was more than just a woman of resilience. She was a force, a quiet yet powerful presence that could inspire change. As they prepared to leave, Richard turned to her one last time. "I meant every word, Evelyn. You'd make a difference." She gave him a gentle smile. "And you've given me a lot to think about." With a warm handshake, they parted ways, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone who would change everything. The following morning, Richard arranged a meeting with Evelyn in the company's towering headquarters. He wanted to discuss the campaign idea, but the anticipation in his chest suggested he expected something more. A partnership with someone who could ground his vision with her lived wisdom. As she entered the sleek, modern lobby, dressed in her signature blue jacket, heads turned. Evelyn's composed aura filled the space as she approached Richard, who greeted her with a warm smile. "Evelyn, I'm glad you came. You look radiant," he said, gesturing toward the elevators. "Thank you, Richard. I must say, it's a bit strange seeing this side of things. Usually, I'm just a passenger," she chuckled, her eyes twinkling with both amusement and curiosity. Once they reached his office, they settled into a large, sunlit room with a view of the city's skyline. Evelyn looked around, taking in the opulence that contrasted so sharply with her own modest home. Richard noted her observation and couldn't help but feel a pang of self-consciousness. "Do you know, I've been in this office for years, but it never felt as grounded as it does now," Richard admitted, leaning forward. "Evelyn, I've asked you here because I want to show you the heart of this company." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what exactly is at the heart of your company, Richard?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "It's not where it should be. This company has grown fast, and somewhere along the way, we lost the core value of respect." He looked directly at her. "That's why I want you to be our ambassador, Evelyn. We need someone who reminds us why kindness matters." Evelyn took a moment, her gaze soft yet thoughtful. "Richard, are you looking for a spokesperson, or are you looking for change?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Both. But change won't come from policies alone. We need someone like you to inspire it genuinely." The room fell silent as she considered his proposal. After a beat, Evelyn leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Richard, before I can give you my answer, I want to be clear about something. If I say yes, it won't be for appearances. I'll expect real commitment to changing how people are treated, not just on paper, but in practice." Richard nodded, his expression resolute. "I wouldn't ask for anything less, Evelyn." "Good. Because I have a few ideas of my own," she replied with a small, knowing smile. Richard leaned back, clearly intrigued. "Oh, do tell." "First, I want a training program for the staff. Something that teaches them not just customer service skills, but empathy. It's one thing to follow a checklist. It's another to treat people with humanity." He nodded slowly. "That's ambitious, but I like it." "And," she continued, her eyes glinting with a fierce kindness, "I want it to be mandatory for everyone, from the top to the bottom, including you, Richard." He laughed, surprised but delighted. "You're serious?" "Very. Respect starts from the top. If you're not willing to set the example, how can we expect anyone else to follow?" Richard stared at her, admiration deepening in his gaze. "You have yourself a deal, Evelyn. Consider it done." Just then, there was a knock at the door. A staff member entered, a tall woman with a nervous air about her. "Mr. Sanders, sorry to interrupt, but we have the meeting with the board in 10 minutes, she informed him, glancing curiously at Evelyn. Richard thanked her and turned back to Evelyn, his eyes alight with excitement. "Would you be willing to join me in this meeting? I want the board to meet the woman who's about to transform this place." Evelyn considered it, then nodded. "All right, but let's keep things real. No glossing over the truth." Richard laughed. "Agreed." The boardroom was bustling with executives when Richard and Evelyn entered. The board members' expressions ranged from curiosity to outright skepticism as they saw Richard's guest. "Everyone," Richard began, standing at the head of the table. "I'd like to introduce you to Evelyn Thompson. Evelyn is the woman who's about to help us redefine our approach to customer service." An older man at the end of the table leaned forward, eyeing her with a mixture of doubt and interest. "And how, exactly, does Mrs. Thompson plan to achieve this?" Evelyn, sensing the hesitation, stepped forward. "I plan to bring kindness and respect back into this company. You may think these are soft skills, but they are the foundation of any meaningful connection with people. I believe you've all forgotten what it means to treat others as equals." There was a murmur of surprise among the board members. Richard watched, impressed by her unflinching tone. A woman with an expensive suit and an air of authority spoke next. "Mrs. Thompson, with all due respect, we're running a business here. How do you propose we make kindness profitable?" Evelyn's gaze was steady. "By recognizing that respect and trust create loyalty, and loyal customers are what keep a business thriving. I'm not here to overhaul your profits. I'm here to make sure that in the pursuit of success, you don't lose your humanity." The room fell silent, each member contemplating her words. Richard saw the shift in their faces, the beginning of understanding. Another man, younger and visibly moved, cleared his throat. "I think Mrs. Thompson has a point. We can't afford to overlook what she's saying." Richard nodded, pleased. "Evelyn, I think you've given everyone something to think about." As they left the boardroom, Richard turned to her, a new respect in his eyes. "You were incredible in there." She chuckled, a twinkle in her eye. "I just said what needed to be said." "And Richard, there's something else you need to know." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Evelyn's smile was gentle but firm. "I'm not just an ambassador. I'm also one of your shareholders, Richard. This company was part of my late husband's legacy, and I've kept it all these years." Richard's jaw dropped, a look of astonishment crossing his face. You're one of our major shareholders?" She nodded. "I never felt the need to make it known. But now that we're working together, I think it's time you knew. I'm invested in this company's future, literally." Richard was speechless, his respect for her deepening. Finally, he broke into a grin. "Well, Evelyn, I can see I have a lot to learn from you. And I couldn't be happier about it." Evelyn laughed, her eyes shining. "Good, Richard. Because I'm here to make sure we leave this world a little better than we found it." They shared a handshake, one filled with mutual respect and understanding, knowing they were on the cusp of a partnership that could change the very heart of the company. In the weeks that followed her revelation as a shareholder, Evelyn became a regular at the headquarters. She held meetings, reviewed policies, and even led sessions on empathy and service. She had not anticipated the response from employees. Many approached her with stories of their own, confessions of times they had felt ignored or dismissed. She listened patiently, her warm, wise gaze offering comfort without judgment. One afternoon, as Evelyn finished her session, she found Richard waiting for her outside the conference room. He looked thoughtful, as if something weighed on him. "Evelyn," he began, "I need to talk to you about the campaign. Well, let's just say not everyone on the board is supportive." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly do they have concerns about?" Richard sighed, guiding her down the hallway. "Some think this shift is too radical. They worry that we're making a big deal out of a simple incident. They don't see the need to overhaul how we treat customers because of one bad stewardess." Evelyn chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Ah, yes. Because one simple incident is never a sign of deeper issues, right?" she said, her voice dripping with irony. Richard nodded, giving her a rueful smile. "Exactly. They think I'm overreacting." Evelyn's expression turned serious. "Richard, how can they understand if they're not willing to even listen to the stories of the people who work here? Or of the passengers? That's the thing. They won't listen, yet. But I have an idea." Richard's eyes lit up. "I want to invite them to one of your sessions. If they can see the impact of what you're doing firsthand, maybe they'll change their minds." Evelyn gave him a long, measured look. "Are they open to it, Richard? Or are we inviting them to satisfy their curiosity?" "Maybe both," he admitted. "But it's a start, isn't it?" After a pause, she nodded. "All right. Let them come. But I won't hold back, Richard. If they're coming, they're going to hear the truth. Raw and unfiltered. Richard grinned. I wouldn't expect anything less. On the day of the session, a few board members, including the same skeptics who had questioned Evelyn's approach, joined the employees in the conference room. Evelyn noticed their stiff, detached expressions, but carried on as she always did. The session began with a story from a young man named Jamie, who worked in the baggage department. He spoke about his experiences facing dismissive attitudes from passengers and even other staff, and how it had impacted his sense of pride in his work. Evelyn encouraged him gently. Jamie, your work is essential to this company, and I want you to know that. You deserve the same respect as anyone else. Jamie looked down, fighting back tears. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. It's just, no one's ever said that to me. Evelyn glanced toward the board members, her gaze steady. Do you see what I mean? She asked, her voice directed at them as much as the room. One of the board members, Mr. Carter, shifted uncomfortably. But, Mrs. Thompson, these incidents are unfortunate, yes, but they're not systemic. Surely they don't represent the entire company? Evelyn's expression softened, though her tone remained firm. Mr. Carter, it's not just about isolated incidents. It's about creating a culture where every employee feels valued. These small acts of disrespect add up, and when they're ignored, they become part of the system. Another board member, Ms. Harrington, crossed her arms defensively. But we're here to maximize profits, Evelyn, not run a therapy session for employees. Respect is a nice idea, but we can't let it interfere with the bottom line. Richard's expression hardened, but before he could speak, Evelyn stepped forward. Ms. Harrington, I used to be a teacher. My students came from all walks of life, and I knew that if I didn't treat them with respect, they wouldn't listen, wouldn't grow. And let me tell you, those children became successful because they learned to value themselves. Your employees, your customers, they are no different. If you treat people with respect, they invest in you in return. That's what builds real loyalty. A quiet settled over the room, broken only by the soft murmur of agreement from some of the employees in the back. Miss Harrington looked away, her face flushed. Richard cleared his throat, stepping in. And that loyalty is what will sustain us, long after quick profits dry up. We're not asking you to change everything overnight, but to support a culture shift that benefits everyone, Evelyn added, and let me be clear. This isn't about a therapy session. It's about building a company that truly values people, because that's how we make a lasting impact. That's how we become more than just a business. The board members remained silent, visibly affected by her words. After the session, as the board members dispersed, Mr. Carter lingered, his expression softened. Approaching Evelyn, he cleared his throat, looking unsure of himself. Mrs. Thompson, he began. I wanted to thank you for your words. I think I needed to hear that. He hesitated, then continued. You know, my daughter works in customer service, and I sometimes forget the challenges she faces every day. Evelyn gave him a gentle smile. Sometimes, all we need is a reminder, Mr. Carter. And I appreciate you staying back to share that with me. He nodded, visibly moved. Please call me Tom. And, if you ever need any support on the board, I'll be there. As he walked away, Evelyn turned to Richard, who was beaming with pride. You did it, Evelyn. You reached them, he said, his voice filled with admiration. She shook her head. No, Richard. We did it together. And I think we're only just beginning. That evening, Evelyn sat in a quiet cafe with Richard. He looked across the table, his expression more serious than she'd seen in some time. Evelyn, I have to ask you something. When you stepped up to speak today, there was something in your eyes. Something personal. Evelyn took a long breath, her eyes distant. I haven't spoken much about my husband, Richard. He was a good man, strong and proud. He built this legacy, this company, not just for profit, but to create something lasting, something honorable. She looked down, her voice softer. When he passed, I promised him that I would carry that legacy forward. But I thought that meant staying in the background, letting others lead. Now I see that he would have wanted me to stand up and fight for what he believed in. Richard reached across the table, covering her hand with his. He'd be proud of you, Evelyn. More than you could ever know. She smiled, her eyes misty. I hope so, Richard. I really do. They sat there in silence, two people from different worlds, but bound by a shared vision, each finding strength in the other. Evelyn felt a renewed purpose, a sense that her husband's legacy lived on, not just in the company, but in the values they were fighting to uphold. As they parted, Evelyn knew that her journey was far from over. But she also knew that, with Richard by her side, they could transform not just a company but perhaps even inspire change in the world beyond. As the months passed, Evelyn's impact spread far beyond the boardrooms and customer service counters. Her insistence on respect and empathy inspired not only the airline but also communities that heard her story. Her words resonated with people who often felt unseen, and soon, local organizations invited her to speak, intrigued by the story of the elderly woman who had the courage to reshape a corporate giant. One evening, Richard called Evelyn, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and something she couldn't quite place. Evelyn, are you sitting down? I have news. She smiled, warmth in her tone. All right, Richard. You sound like a child on Christmas morning. What is it? He laughed, taking a deep breath. Your story is reaching further than we ever imagined. I just got off the phone with a journalist from a major magazine. They want to feature you, Evelyn. They want to tell your story in a way that could inspire thousands more. Evelyn's eyes widened. Me? Oh, Richard. I'm not sure I'm ready for all of that. Richard's tone softened. You don't have to be perfect, Evelyn. You just have to be you. People are inspired by your honesty, your strength, everything you represent. Let the world see the real Evelyn. After a pause, Evelyn nodded. All right, Richard. I'll do it. If there's even a chance that sharing my story can help others find their voice, then it's worth it. On the day of the interview, Evelyn sat in a bright studio, her simple blue jacket contrasting sharply with the camera lights and polished set. The journalist, a young woman named Sarah, greeted her warmly, her gaze filled with admiration. Mrs. Thompson, it's truly an honor, Sarah began, her voice sincere. Your story has touched so many lives. What made you decide to speak out, to push for change? Evelyn thought for a moment, her gaze distant. I think it wasn't really a decision, Sarah. It was more of a realization. I realized that if I stayed silent, if I accepted mistreatment, I'd be telling others that it was okay to treat people poorly. And I couldn't bear that thought. Sarah nodded, captivated. And did you ever imagine it would come this far? That you would be here, inspiring thousands? Evelyn chuckled, her voice tinged with humility. Oh, no. I thought I'd be helping a few people on a single flight, maybe. But life has a way of surprising you. As the interview continued, Evelyn shared stories of her past, her late husband's legacy, and the values that had shaped her. Her words flowed naturally, filled with warmth and conviction, reaching hearts far beyond the studio walls. Following the interview, Evelyn returned home, where a package awaited her. She carefully opened it to find an advanced copy of her newly published book, a culmination of her life's stories and the lessons she had learned. Her grandson, James, had helped her write it, capturing every detail with care. Later that week, at her book launch event, Richard joined Evelyn, beaming with pride. He stood by her side as guests arrived, offering her words of encouragement. I never thought this day would come, Evelyn murmured, overwhelmed by the turnout. Richard squeezed her shoulder. Evelyn, this is just the beginning. Your story, it's a gift to everyone here. During the event, Evelyn stepped onto the stage, looking out at the crowd, which included her family, friends, and even some familiar faces from the airline. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. When I first stepped onto that plane months ago, I was just a woman hoping to see her grandson. I never imagined that I would be standing here today, sharing my journey with all of you, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. Her eyes scanned the audience, meeting the gaze of people who listened intently. I want you all to remember one thing. Kindness is not just an action. It's a choice, one we make every single day. And in a world that sometimes feels so full of division and disrespect, choosing kindness is one of the most powerful things we can do. Applause echoed through the room, and as Evelyn continued, she felt the weight of her message settle in each heart, knowing that her words would linger far beyond this night. As the event wound down, Evelyn found herself sitting beside Richard in a quiet corner of the room, each reflecting on the journey they had taken together. "Evelyn, do you know how much you've changed my life?" Richard asked, his tone gentle. "Before I met you, I thought I understood leadership. I thought I knew what it meant to run a company. But you taught me that leadership isn't about power. It's about purpose." Evelyn's smile was soft. "And you, Richard, taught me that it's never too late to use our voice, to stand for what we believe in. I never thought my life would take this turn, but I'm grateful it did." As they sat in comfortable silence, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. Her late husband's legacy had found new life, woven into the fabric of a company and community that now understood the value of empathy and respect. "Thank you, Evelyn," Richard whispered, his voice filled with gratitude.